billion-dollar aid programs that go to that will go directly to government, but billion-dollar aid programs that end up assisting people directly, and people can see how these programs have assisted them. It was mentioned that I worked in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, and that was one of those areas where I did a lot of people-to-people work. And I didn't really realize the connection until I came here tonight. But one of the programs I worked on in Pakistan was to assist Iranian Baha'i refugees who were living in Pakistan who wanted to come to the United States to be resettled. I don't know if there's anyone in this room who might have benefited from that program, or if you know anyone that benefited from that program. But we brought hundreds, if not thousands, of Baha'is to the United States who had fled Iran because they were being persecuted because of their religion. So I look forward to continuing this dialogue with you and opening up the discussion on diplomacy.
I have two suggestions. We're going to have a lot of very insightful things. So the dialogue news, we will, I think you would hold your, what I'm sure is well-deserved applause with the end of the dialogue, so our participants can actually continue on with the engagement without applause. Without too much applause, the next question I'd like to ask is for Dr. Monsfield, because Dr. Monsfield has had a distinguished career in the U.S. Foreign Service, and then he, I say, switched tracks to what was called two-track diplomacy. I was wondering if you would, first of all, since he is credited actually with creating the term two-track diplomacy, explain to people sort of what that means and why you sort of went from one track to the other.
Well, it's also a great pleasure for me to be here tonight with this huge crowd of virtuous people that you identified. I was in the Bureau of Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs when I fell in with a bunch of psychiatrists who were interested in using their skills to support the first Camp David agreement, the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement. And I'd been working on the Middle East for a long time, even though when I came back to the State Department, I was told Linda in the Africa Bureau, because North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya were part of the Africa Bureau, and then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger decided to rip off North Africa and add it to the Near East Bureau. But focusing on the Arab-Israeli problem year after year, decade after decade, caused a great deal of frustration. I had a number of friends who were Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the peace process in the Near East Bureau, and they kept retiring early. And felt that there was something missing in our diplomacy. Somehow these intractable conflicts with religious dimensions and dimensions of great traumatic loss were not being susceptible to traditional problem-solving diplomacy, deal-making, lawyers, diplomats. Somehow it didn't work. And there's not a small bit of irony that this great state of Maryland hosted the most recent Israeli-Arab peace conference in Annapolis, which was a step forward in the fact that the important Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, sat in the same room as the Israeli partners. It's been several decades since I began to think that there must be something else that we can do to supplement diplomacy. And working with the psychiatrists really showed me there's a dimension that traditional diplomacy just doesn't incorporate. It's not part of the conceptual toolkit. That there are emotional needs, wounds of history that simply aren't on the agenda for a traditional negotiation. And I want to hasten to add that Linda's bureau, I agree with everything she said, that Africa, the African continent, has had the benefit, for the most part, of not having very much oil, and therefore not much attention from the power of politicians in our own government and other governments. And therefore, the virtue of the public servants in it, and she's a very distinguished example of that, was allowed freer play to do good things, to really be good public servants. because it was a blessing not to have senior people in the White House plotting with the CIA and the Secretary of Defense and how to use hard power, coercive power to protect our oil and of course we did battle it and then we run over a lot of countries in Africa over competing with the Soviet Union, but still there was room for the virtue. So I got drawn into it, and I must say that my supervisors in the State Department were always very broad-minded, and I did a lot of moonlighting in factory diplomacy before I actually left the Foreign Service. And my colleagues there and supervisors recognized there's something to this involving an unofficial layer of facilitating communication between groups in conflict that might have something in it, and they all share the same frustration about the difficulties, the limitations of traditional diplomacy.
We've used the word traditional, and as Americans, I had right before this Gabrielle talking to Mrs. Moe, she was telling me about a trip she had to England where she said to some English woman, "Are there any old ruins here?" And she said, "I don't think so. There's nothing before 1066 around." So when Americans speak about traditional, we have a shallow, somewhat time frame. And the reason I bring this up is Mr. Chuck Doliak, who I want to encourage you all after this is to take a look at the material that's in the back of the room on what he will enlighten us about. But I'd like to ask you, Chuck, could you verbally tell us a bit about the history of what the peace treaty in the process? Because it's this event that happened in 1905 that inspired sort of the idea of this dialogue, and I think gives us a little different cast on what is traditional and maybe what is something that is circular or occasional or secular. So could you give us a sense of what happened at Fort Smith and how you see that as related to what we call two-track diplomacy or more than two-track diplomacy?
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. I'm just a simple country lawyer from New Hampshire. And I don't have the experience in the State Department diplomacy, which makes me a good messenger from Portsmouth because in 1905, the largest land and sea war ever fought between two nations, the largest one before World War I, waged between Russia and Japan in Korea and Manchuria. The only neutral power that could come to the fore to create a place for peace negotiations was the United States. Luckily, Teddy Roosevelt was the president at the time. He took to the world stage and convinced the Russians and the Japanese to come to the United States to end a hot war. They were slaughtering each other in Asia, and they hated each other. And it had the potential to become World War I because of the interlinking alliances. Teddy Roosevelt was known for using informal diplomacy and for attempting to try to create peace in other international disputes. He was trusted by the other parties. But the Russians and the Japanese insisted that they must negotiate directly. Neither one of them wanted Roosevelt or anyone else at the table. So what did Teddy Roosevelt do? He entrusted to the city of Portsmouth, the governor of New Hampshire, interestingly enough, as we just see with the naturalists, the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard and the United States Navy to be the host of the formal negotiations, while the state of New Hampshire and the local people, including, by the way, a lot of religious organizations, including a very major Baha'i contingent, to be the informal host, maybe this other track that we've been talking about. And for 30 days, the negotiations went on. The negotiations stalled for 10 days. They were absolutely deadlocked. And when that occurred, Roosevelt engaged in back-channel diplomacy, and the local people, the religious organizations, the social groups, and to try to explain all of them, I will direct you to the chart in the background. Essentially, local people got the opportunity to facilitate the communication and to create the atmosphere to keep the diplomats at the table, and then I'm a mediator, so there was something that we mediators often say, there was a sudden outbreak of reason. And they ended the largest land and sea war ever fought between two nations at that time.